Welcome to 5 Good Minutes. You're listening to today's inspirational message on the book of Galatians with Bryce Vaught.
Today we're going to be kicking off Galatians chapter 3, and I want to start this week by looking at verses 1 through 11. Now, with the time constraint, I won't take the time to read it all myself. So at this point, if you haven't done so already, you may want to go ahead and pause the audio and read those verses yourself. As we come to Galatians chapter 3, we find ourselves approaching the midpoint of probably the most emotionally charged of all of Paul's epistles. I mean, he's like a well-trained lawyer, and he's been laying out his defense of the gospel in a way that is just filled with passion and deep conviction. It's a logical argument. The whole letter it's got strong language, and it has key pieces of evidence that is meant to make it nearly impossible for his audience to refute, and it would hopefully result in a changed mind and behavior. Now, as you read through this letter, I mean, his frustration and sense of urgency has become almost palpable. If you aren't familiar with the context, you might initially think that this community had drifted into some kind of demonic witchcraft or worse. You then might be surprised to learn that this community was still trying to please the God of the Bible. They were trying to live moral lives. It even appears that they were seeking to grow in their faith. And clearly, Paul isn't upset by these type of desires, so we might begin to wonder, what's the problem? He's really, ultimately, deeply concerned with how they are going about their pursuit of growth. He says the Galatians had become bewitched. He starts chapter 3 calling the Galatians foolish and saying that they had been bewitched by people. And again, it's strong language, but it's intentional. It's meant to get their attention so that they would hear and respond to what he has to say. Particularly, the group that had become, this group of believers had become bewitched by Judaizers. These are Jewish influencers who claim to be Christians, and now they were encouraging the community to return to observing the Old Testament law. Really, they kind of followed in after Paul left, and they were exhorting the Galatian church that, hey, this is good that you've come to faith, but we know the old law, and if you want to continue to please God, this is how you do it. And it's here where the ultimate problem lies. Because as they had returned to the law, they had forfeited living by faith in the Spirit, and they now started to live out their spiritual lives by the flesh. The flesh, I think we often tend to think that it's equated with, our physical needs and specifically maybe sexual sins, but I think it's better to understand the flesh as the orientation toward the self. It's really the seat of selfish desires. The flesh is primarily concerned with self-exaltation and self-preservation. And so Paul's frustration is from this, that the church in Galatia had drifted from a reliance upon the finished work of Christ to a reliance upon themselves. Even though they knew they were saved by grace through faith, they had been fooled to believe that their continued acceptance before God now rested on their own self-sufficiency. Now, here's two common dangers that come from our reliance upon ourself as our source of confidence before God, our righteousness and our acceptance before Him. The reality is, we know this from Scripture, that the standard for righteousness, the ability to stand before God, to have confidence in our spiritual life, is perfection. We must be perfect, and we just don't have what it takes to live up to it. When we live out of a reliance upon ourselves, two common errors take place. One, we deceive ourselves into thinking that we're better than we are. The reality is that some of us get to be pretty good at doing what is considered right. There are those of us who live good moral lives, yet eventually will fall into being proud and resist relying upon God and His grace. The other error is that we'll fall into this crushing self-condemnation. We'll soon become very aware of our inability to live up to God's perfect standard, and will struggle to believe God's love and acceptance of us. Freedom from these errors is found in our reliance upon Christ by faith. good news of the gospel is not just that God has saved us from our past sin, in the sense that we now have a clean slate to try to be good again. But the good news is that God is now saving us from the power and influence of sin through the indwelling presence of the Spirit. The Galatians had been burdened by a message of self-reliance, that they needed to maintain God's acceptance through their own effort. The reality is that we have been freed through the finished work of Christ on the cross. So now we can live confidently before Him, knowing that He has created us, He's renewed our hearts, He's equipped me with the presence of His Spirit, who has promised to lead us in all truth, conform us to the image of Christ, and finish the good work He started. It's this truth that we now rely on as we grow and mature as children loved by God. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks for joining us here today. There's a lot of great content to explore on Orchard Hill Plus and on the Orchard Hill main feed from the weekend. Have a great day.